Nottingham Castle was holding its breath that night. The wind worried at the stone like it had teeth, slipping through the cracks in the walls and making the torches gutter along the passageways. Somewhere above, behind thick doors and soft tapestries, there was laughter, glasses clinking, music drifting, the kind of comfort that belongs to people who believe nothing can touch them. I stood in the dark, without a sword in my hand, yet I felt sharper than any blade I owned, because what I carried into that night wasn't steel, it was a decision. They called me King, Edward III, yet for years my crown had been little more than a polished mask. I sat at the highest table, I rode in processions, I sealed letters with my name, but England did not truly move at my command. It moved at the will of my mother, Queen Isabella, and the man who stood beside her like a shadow that had learned to speak, Roger Mortimer. They ruled in my name, they spoke through me, they hid behind my youth the way a soldier hides behind a shield. And in the great halls, whenever power entered the room, it did not drift toward my chair, it drifted toward theirs. I was 17, an age when most men are still learning the weight of a sword, the patience of a horse, the pride of a family name. But I had been forced to learn something heavier, what it feels like to be the symbol of a kingdom while someone else holds the reins. And I had begun to understand the truth that no boy wants to learn about his own mother. Love does not always mean surrender, and blood does not always mean loyalty. My mother had crossed the line long ago, first to save England from my father's failures, then to save herself from the chaos she helped create. Somewhere along that road, she stopped walking for me. In the months leading up to this night, the air in court had become thin and dangerous. Rumors moved faster than messengers. Men spoke in whispers about plots, about the old king, about who truly held England. I watched Mortimer grow bold, watched him sit like a master in a house that was not his, watched him treat my crown as a tool he could pick up and set down when it pleased him. And there came a moment when I knew, if I let this continue, I would spend my life as a figure painted onto a banner, visible, celebrated, and useless. William Montague stepped close beside me, his cloak dark with damp, his voice barely more than breath. "This way, Your Grace." Montague was the one man I trusted without having to force myself. Loyal, quiet, steady, the sort of man who doesn't love power for its own sake, but understands what it costs. He had found the path that would bring us where we needed to go, a hidden route into the heart of the castle, a way around the guards, a way around the certainty Mortimer believed he had built. We moved like a small storm, not loud, never loud, but unstoppable. Down we went into a narrow stair and into a passage where the stones sweated with cold. Water dripped from the ceiling in a steady rhythm, like the castle itself counting down the seconds. The air smelled of wet rock and old smoke. Each step echoed softly and died quickly, swallowed by the tunnel. Above us, the castle lived its usual life. Music, servants, comfort, courtly illusion. Down here, there was only truth. A truth with no audience, no applause, no excuse. I remember thinking as we walked that this was what kingship truly was. Not the ceremony, not the crown, but the moment you step forward alone and accept what cannot be undone. We reached the last door. Above it, faint warmth, the sound of voices. A laugh I recognized, Mortimer's, confident and careless. Montague yipped at me one final time. His face was tight, controlled, as if his very muscles were holding the plan together. I nodded. The door opened. Light spilled out like fire. The chamber was rich. Tapestries, a hearth glowing, goblets on a table. The kind of room where people discuss the fates of nations as if it were a game. My mother turned toward us first. My mother, beautiful, composed, unshaken. Even now, even at the edge of disaster, she held herself like a queen who believed the world would eventually forgive her. Mortimer rose more slowly. He didn't bow. He didn't step back. He looked at me as if I were still a child who had wandered into the wrong hall. And for one heartbeat, the room hung in silence. My mother spoke my name like a warning. Edward! Her eyes searched my face, looking for hesitation, looking for the boy she could still command. Mortimer's gaze was colder, not maternal, not even angry, just measuring, like a man deciding whether a door can be broken. In that moment, I understood something with perfect clarity. If I showed doubt now, I would never escape it again. So I did not shout. I did not rush forward. I did not try to win the moment with noise. I stepped into the room with the calm of someone who has already made peace with what comes next, and I spoke plainly. Mother, from this night on, England will hear my voice. You could feel it, the shift, like the air itself changing pressure. Servants recoiled. One man stumbled back, bumping a chair. Someone gasped. But Isabella did not scream. She did not plead. She simply stared, as if the son she had shaped into a symbol had suddenly become a man. Mortimer's hand moved subtly toward his belt. Not a dramatic gesture, just the instinct of a man who had always believed he could solve problems by force. But my companions were already there. Two of them stepped forward and seized his arms with firm, grounded control. No chaos, no spectacle, just the simple reality of strength applied at the right moment. Mortimer resisted for a second, one brief surge of will. Then the room settled again, tense and quiet. He was still breathing, still upright, still proud, but he was no longer free. Isabella lifted a hand as if to command them to stop. Then, just as quickly, she lowered it. Perhaps she realized what I had realized. The moment had passed. The boy was gone. The king was standing in front of her. I looked at my mother then, not with hatred, not with triumph, but with something harder to name, a kind of sorrow wrapped in iron, because no victory tastes clean when you win it against your own blood. I will not harm you, I said quietly, but you will not rule. Her lips tightened. For a flicker of time, I saw something behind her eyes, shock, anger, maybe even fear, and then it vanished, sealed behind the same masks she had worn at courts in England and France. Mortimer was led away. His boots scraped over the rushes on the floor. A goblet rolled and clinked against the table leg. The hearth fire crackled. Ordinary sounds, suddenly loud. When the door closed behind them, the room felt emptier before. Not because Mortimer was gone, but because the illusion was gone. The illusion that I could wait, that I could grow older and the kingdom would simply fall into my hands. Power does not fall. Power must be taken, or it is taken from you. Later, much later, people would argue over what I did that night. Some would call it justice. Some would call it betrayal. Some would call it inevitable. Let them argue. I know what it felt like. It felt like stepping out of a cage and realizing you still have to build a world, because that was only the first step. England was not calm. Scotland was not quiet. France was watching. The treasury was strained. The nobles were restless. And the crown, my crown, was not a jewel. It was a promise made of metal, heavy and unforgiving. As I left the chamber and walked back into the torch-lit corridors of Nottingham, I could still hear the echo of laughter fading behind stone. I could still smell smoke and damp, and I could still feel the cold certainty of what I had done settling onto my shoulders like a cloak. That night, I did not become a different person. That night, I became what I had been called for years. At last, in truth, a king.
I was born at Windsor Castle on the 13th of November in the year 1312, behind thick stone walls that had seen generations of kings arrive, rule, and vanish. People later told me my birth was greeted with relief, even joy, not because England suddenly became a gentler place overnight, but because a kingdom that has no clear heir is a kingdom that invites wolves. My father, King Edward II, already had an illegitimate son, Adam Fitzroy, but illegitimacy is a fragile bridge in a storm. A lawful prince meant certainty. It meant continuity. It meant the crown had somewhere to land. Yet the truth is, I did not arrive into a calm household or a calm realm. I arrived into an England that felt like a great hall with the hearth going cold. where everyone speaks softly because they're not sure which wall has ears. My grandfather had been Edward I, Edward Longshanks. Even the name sounded like iron. He ruled with the force of a man who believed order was a sacred duty. Under him, Wales was brought fully under English control. Scotland was pressed hard. The machinery of governments grew sharper, more centralized, more disciplined than most kingdoms in Europe. He did not just fight wars, he built systems. He left behind a state that looked powerful enough to survive any weather. But when he died, the storm didn't stop. It changed shape. My father inherited everything: crown, armies, laws, the weight of a dynasty, and yet he never held it with my grandfather's certainty. Edward II was not without intelligence, not without charm, but he lacked something that makes a king dangerous in the right way: the ability to keep his favorites from becoming masters. The first name that haunted his reign was Piers Gaveston. I was too young to remember Gaveston with my own eyes, but I grew up in the shadow of the stories. They said Gaveston rose too high, too fast. He was showered with titles, offices, land, placed above men whose families had served the crown for generations. And in a world where rank is a language everyone speaks, that was an insult written in flame. For a time, my father exiled him. Then he returned, and in the summer of 1312, only months before I was born, Gaveston was taken by powerful nobles and put to death. However people tried to dress it up, the message was simple. The nobility would not tolerate being humiliated by a single man protected by the king's affection. If that had been the end of it, perhaps my father might have learned. But the court, once it tastes this kind of poison, rarely recovers quickly. After Gaveston, another family rose into the same dangerous position: the Despensers. Hugh Despenser the Younger became the next shadow at my father's shoulder. With each year, resentment in the realm hardened. Land disputes, rivalries, confiscations, too many grievances, too much smoke. And my mother, Queen Isabella, began to pull away from my father, not in public at first, but in the quiet places where real decisions are born. People later called my mother the she-wolf of France. It's an easy label: sharp, dramatic, memorable. But my earliest impressions of her were different: a woman of frightening composure. She had been born into the French royal house, raised among palaces that gleamed with ceremony and calculation. She married my father in early 1308, a girl not fully grown, and she arrived in England to find a court already cracking. When you grow up in that kind of tension, you learn early that love and politics are not always separate. Sometimes they are the same rope, just pulled from different ends. The kingdom outside Windsor was no calmer than the court. In 1414, England suffered a disaster in Scotland at Bannockburn. Robert the Bruce's forces defeated ours, and the dream of my grandfather's dominance there began to dissolve. It wasn't just a military blow, it was a shock to the idea that English power was unstoppable. Then came hunger. The Great Famine of the mid-13 teens didn't care who wore a crown. The rains ruined harvests, stores emptied, people grew desperate. It is hard to hold a realm steady when the earth itself refuses to cooperate. And through all of this, through shifting alliances, cold councils, ruined campaigns, there I was, a child in a separate household, being trained for kingship as if kingship were a clean, predictable craft. Surprisingly, I was never made Prince of Wales. That title would later become the usual mark of the heir, but in my youth it did not settle on my shoulders. Instead, I carried the title Earl of Chester, still prestigious, still meaningful, but different, almost like a reminder that my place, though promised, was not yet secured. My education was practical. I learned to read and write in English and French, the languages of my world. Latin I could manage only in the limited way a warrior king might need. Books mattered, yes, but what mattered more was the outward world, the weight of a sword, the rhythm of a horse, the discipline of a camp. At Windsor, there were training yards where boys became squires and squires became men-at-arms. I remember the smell of leather and straw in the stables, the cold sting of morning air on the battlements, the sound of practice weapons striking wood with that dull, honest thud that tells you what force truly feels like. When I first tried to handle a bow, it was not romantic. The string bit into the fingers until you learned how to hold it properly. The pull demanded strength and patience. It taught you something important. Power is not in a single dramatic moment. Power is in repetition. In those years, I also watched my family expand. My brother, John, was born in 1316, then my sisters Eleanor and Joan. In a normal household, that would have meant warmth, children laughing, games in corridors, familiar noise. And sometimes it did. But even in a nursery, you could feel the court's tension. Servants spoke carefully, guards stood too close, letters came and went too quickly. It's strange, but as a child, you often don't understand danger by its causes. You understand it by its atmosphere. You sense it in the way adults lower their voices when you enter the room. You sense it in the sudden silence that follows a name spoken too loudly. At times, I felt Windsor itself watching, not as a superstition, not as a child's fantasy of ghosts, but as an awareness of scale. Those walls were built to outlast men. A king might ride out in glory and return in disgrace, and the castle would remain. Standing under its arches, you could feel how small a human life was compared to stone. Some nights, I dreamed of corridors that stretched longer than they should, of shadows that looked like towering figures, of torchlight that flickered as if the castle were breathing. In those dreams, I walked alone, and the stone did not speak, but it asked a question without words. What kind of king will you be? In the daytime, that question returned in a different shape, not from stone, but from men. I watched my father's council gatherings from a distance. I watched powerful lords, men wrapped in fur and lineage, sit with faces like locked doors. I watched Dispenser lean close to the king, whispering. I watched my mother observe from the side, eyes cold, as if she were measuring the room and calculating the moment she would have to stop pretending. And even though I was only a boy, I understood one thing clearly. England was not being led. England was being pulled. Pulled by factions, pulled by pride, pulled by old grudges that never truly died, pulled by Scotland on the border, pulled by France across the sea, pulled by hunger and by fear. I think that is why when I trained, when I rode, when I practiced with a blade, when I tried to strike the pel cleanly and reset my stance, I felt more than discipline. I felt a kind of promise forming inside me. Not a promise I could yet speak aloud, but one that grew stronger with each year. Because in a world like mine, a crown does not protect a weak will. A crown exposes it. And if I was ever to wear that crown in truth, not in name, not as a puppet, not as a child set on a throne to keep others comfortable, then I would need more than bloodline. I would need steadiness. I would need control. I would need to become the one who sets the rhythm instead of being dragged by it. I didn't know how quickly that lesson would be tested. I didn't know how quickly the next great turn of my life would come from France, from my own mother's choices, and from a journey that would transform me from heir into a pawn on a board far larger than Windsor. But the first shape of that destiny was already there, in the cold stone of my birthplace, in the arguments I overheard from behind doors, and in the quiet realization that England I inherited was not a gift, it was a storm, and someday it would demand that I become the eye of it.
I was 12 years old when I left England for France, and even then I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't a simple journey. People around me called it diplomacy, a necessary mission, a matter of negotiations and honor. But to a boy who had grown up inside whispers and watched adults hide their true meanings behind polite words, it felt like something else. It felt like being moved. I remember the docks, the smell of tar and salt, the way the wind snapped at cloaks and banners as if it wanted to tear secrets out into the open. I remember stepping onto the ship and feeling, for the first time, that the sea was not just water. It was distance. It was separation. It was a door closing behind me. My mother had already gone ahead. In the spring of 1325, Queen Isabella, my mother, daughter of the French king, had sailed for France under the pretext of negotiation. The dispute was over Aquitaine, that strange and dangerous inheritance, English land on French soil, a place that made the King of England, in one part of his identity, a subject to the King of France. It was a feudal knot that never stopped tightening. To make peace, someone had to face the French king, Charles IV, my uncle, and my father, Edward II, did not want to go. He did not want to kneel in a cathedral and perform homage, because even a king can feel shame, and shame is a powerful enemy. So he sent my mother. At first, that may have looked like clever politics, but it was the beginning of his end.
because my mother did not return. She found in France something she had been lacking in England for years: allies, protection, and a chance to strike back at the Despensers, my father's favorites, who had humiliated her, isolated her, and turned the court into a battlefield of gossip and fear. And in France, she met a man who would change everything: Roger Mortimer. He was an English lord in exile, clever and ambitious, the kind of man who could turn resentment into a weapon. He and my mother became close, so close that the court in Paris began to whisper about them the way courts always whisper when they smell scandal and power at the same time. But what mattered more than their intimacy was what their alliance created: a center of opposition to my father's rule, gathering strength across the channel. In September of that same year, 1325, my father sent me to France. Why he did it has always been debated, but in my mind, the reason is simple. He wanted to avoid appearing before Charles IV himself. He thought that if I went, if I stood in his place, the humiliation would be less. He even arranged for Aquitaine to be transferred to me in name, making me, on paper, the Duke, so that I could perform the required homage. To my father, it was a solution. To my mother and Mortimer, it was a gift. Because suddenly, the opposition faction in France had something they lacked before: a figurehead with the strongest legitimacy imaginable, the lawful heir to England, a boy who could be presented not as a rebel, but as the future. And the moment I arrived, I felt it. The air around my mother was different. There were English faces I didn't know, men who bowed too deeply and watched too closely. There were meetings behind closed doors, conversations that stopped when I entered, sudden smiles that didn't reach anyone's eyes. I was treated with respect, yes, but it was the respect you show a symbol, not the respect you show a person. Not long after, my father sent letters commanding that I return to England. My mother refused. That was one of the most frightening realizations of my life. A child grows up believing that a mother is a fixed star, constant, guiding, unshakable. But in that moment, I understood that my mother had chosen a path, and on that path, she would not let even her son stand in the way. I was no longer simply her child. I was leverage. From France, the next move was not made in Paris. It was made in Hainault, a principality in the Low Countries, where money, ships, and soldiers could be found if you knew the right bargains to offer. My mother and Mortimer traveled with them, still a boy, still carried along by decisions I did not control. In Hainault, I met Philippa. She was the daughter of Count William of Hainault, young, poised, and far removed from the violence of English politics. Our marriage was discussed the way merchants discuss cargo. It was not romance. It was a contract. In return for military support, Philippa would become my wife, and I would become the price. I bowed, I nodded, I accepted. What else could I do? In that moment, I was still learning how the world truly worked, that crowns and marriages and even children can be traded when power is at stake. By late September of 1326, we sailed for England. The force we brought was not enormous, but it didn't need to be. England was already cracked. Years of resentment against my father and the Despensers had built up like dry brush waiting for a spark. My mother's arrival was that spark. We landed in Suffolk. I can still picture that shoreline: gray water, wind tugging at cloaks, men stepping down into wet sand with cautious feet. It was not a triumphant arrival. It was a tense, quiet beginning. But even as we marched inland, something became clear with startling speed. Support for my father simply fell away. Lords who had once sworn loyalty turned their backs. Towns opened gates, and most critically, London, the heart of commerce and influence, declared for my mother and for me. When London chose, it wasn't just politics, it was momentum. My father fled west, toward Wales. He was captured and placed under guard at Kenilworth Castle. The Despensers were seized and swiftly executed. Their fall was not gentle. It was the kind of swift ending that happens when a kingdom is trying to cut away an infection before it spreads. And then came the moment that still sits like a stone in my memory. In January of 1327, Parliament declared that my father could no longer rule. They listed failures, grievances, humiliations, and the ruin brought by favoritism. The crown, they decided, must pass to me. I was 14 years old. 14. Old enough to wear armor, old enough to ride a horse hard, and old enough to understand what power looked like, but not old enough to truly hold it. Yet, there I was, standing at the center of a political storm, being lifted onto a throne by the hands of men who were not lifting me for my sake. They were lifting me because I was useful. I was proclaimed King Edward III. The ceremony was performed in London. Then, in Westminster Abbey, I was crowned. Candles, incense, stone vaults soaring overhead, the weight of the crown settling on my head like a promise I had not made. People cheered, clergy blessed, nobles bowed, but inside I felt something that no choir could drown out. The awareness that I had been placed on that throne like a piece on a board. My mother and Mortimer were the ones moving the pieces. The truth is, in those first days, I could do little more than watch. A council existed on paper, bishops, earls, barons, meant to guide the realm during my youth, but in practice, it was my mother and Mortimer who commanded the state. They issued orders, they appointed men, they decided who rose and who fell. My name was on the seals, but their hands were on the handle. And as if the situation was already dangerous enough, another question began to spread through the realm. Quietly at first, then louder. What would happen to my father? Edward II was alive, imprisoned, and still a king in the eyes of some. There were men who believed he should be restored. There were whispers of rescue. There were rumors that my mother's regime was unstable, that Mortimer had grown too powerful, that the realm was trading one crisis for another. I was 14, newly crowned, and my very legitimacy depended on my father staying gone. That is a terrible thing to realize about your own life, that your safety and your crown may require the disappearance of the man who gave you your name. I did not order anything, I did not demand anything, but I watched the world tighten around that problem, like a noose drawn slow. My mother told me we were saving the realm. Mortimer told me we were restoring justice. The lords told me we were securing the future. And I began to understand what kingship could be in its darkest form. Not a shield, but a burden placed on your shoulders while others decide what must be sacrificed to keep it from falling. In those days, the court did not feel like a home. It felt like a stage. I was the king in the center, dressed in the right symbols, speaking the right lines, yet every step I took was watched, weighed, and interpreted by men and women who had lived longer, schemed longer, and understood the ruthless rhythm of power far better than I did. I told myself I would learn. I told myself I would become more than a name on wax, because even then, behind the ceremonies, behind the incense and the applause, I could feel something awakening inside me, a slow, stubborn certainty. This could not be my life forever. A boy can be used for a time. A young king can be guided, controlled, even caged, but a crown is not meant to sit on someone's head while someone else rules. And somewhere in the quiet moments, when the halls emptied and the torches burned low, I began to form the thought that would one day become action. If I did not take my kingship for myself, it would always belong to someone else. Not tomorrow, not in a few years, not when I felt ready, but eventually. And when that day came, England would finally hear my voice, not as a symbol, not as a puppet, but as its king.
For the first years of my reign, I wore the crown the way a child wears an oversized cloak, heavy, impressive to look at, and not truly his. In public, I was called Edward III, King of England. I sat at councils, I listened to petitions, I rode beneath banners while crowds cheered. But behind the ceremony, everyone knew the truth. England was being governed by my mother, Isabella, and her partner in power, Roger Mortimer. They spoke in my name. They signed in my name. They decided in my name. And if I disagreed, the disagreement was quietly smoothed over, as if a young king's opinion were simply another inconvenient draft blowing through the hall. The kingdom itself felt like it was walking on ice, thin, shifting, ready to crack. And in the center of it all was the question no one dared to ask aloud in my presence, yet everyone carried in their eyes. What would happen to my father? Edward II had been deposed, but he was still alive. Alive meant possibility. Alive meant the past could return. Alive meant some faction could rally around him and claim that my coronation had been a mistake, or worse, an act of treason. At first, they kept him at Kenilworth Castle. Then, in the late spring of 1327, he was moved again, this time to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. I remember hearing the name and feeling a chill, not because I knew Berkeley, but because I understood what it meant when a former king is moved from one stronghold to another. It meant the people holding him were searching for a final answer. My mother and Mortimer's regime was unpopular in many circles, and the dissatisfaction grew quickly. Mortimer's power offended nobles who had helped topple my father, but had not expected to trade one favorite for another. Rumors spread, as rumors always do, that my father might be rescued, that he might be restored, that the realm would not accept a government run by a queen and her lover. And then, in September of 1327, the final answer arrived. My father died at Berkeley. The details were never spoken openly in the way ordinary deaths are spoken. There were no long explanations, no public mourning that matched the magnitude of the event. There was just the quiet, heavy certainty that a door had been closed. Even now, historians debate exactly how it happened and by whose hands, but in the world I lived in at the time, the message was clear enough. My father would not return because he could not return. I was young, but I was not blind. I understood what my mother and Mortimer had chosen to do, and I understood why they believed they had to do it. That knowledge did not make me safer inside my own heart. It made me harder. Because if a king can be removed and silenced in this way, then a king's safety depends not only on birthright, but on control. Control of men, of armies, of the political nation, and of his own household. And I was still, by law and custom, a boy. Before I could even find solid ground under my feet, another crisis rose, this one not inside stone walls, but across the northern border. Scotland was watching England's instability like a hawk watches a wounded deer. Robert the Bruce and his commanders began pressing south again, raiding northern England, and even striking at English interests in Ireland. They were not merely testing our defenses, they were testing whether my mother and Mortimer could hold a kingdom together long enough to fight a war. To them, I was a child king. To them, England was distracted. And to them, this was opportunity. So in the summer of 1327, I was taken north on my first campaign. It would later be called the Weardale Campaign, named for the River Wear, where much of the tension unfolded, like a chess match played in fog. My mother and Mortimer wanted a victory. They needed it. They wanted to prove that their regime could defend the realm, and that they ruled not by scandal, but by strength. I rode with the army, surrounded by older men who carried real authority. And yet, even as a teenager, I felt something awaken in me as we marched, a sense that this harsh landscape, this discipline, this danger, was closer to the true core of kinship than any banquet hall. Northern England in summer can be deceptively beautiful, but that year it felt bleak. The wind cut across the moors, and the clouds moved quickly, as if the sky itself refused to settle. Scouts rode out and returned with uncertain reports. The Scots, led by hardened commanders like James Douglas, moved fast and struck where they pleased. It was difficult to bring them to a set battle. For days, both sides maneuvered, searching for advantage. There were moments when the army seemed to drift rather than march, following rumors, chasing shadows. I began to understand how war can exhaust a kingdom, not only through fighting, but through uncertainty. Then we reached the River Wear, and for a brief time it seemed the crisis might end in a decisive engagement. The armies faced each other across rough ground. Men stood at the edges of camps, listening to the wind and watching the hills. But the Scots were not interested in giving us the battle we wanted. Instead, they struck in the way they understood best, suddenly, at night, slipping through darkness and confusion like smoke. On the night of the 3rd of August, moving into the early hours of the 4th, they attacked our camp. Even now, when I think of it, I do not remember it as a series of clear images. I remember it as sensations, torches flaring in the dark, the snap of ropes, the rush of feet on wet ground, the chaotic shouts of men trying to form lines, while the night itself seemed to swallow order. They came through the camp so close, that for a few terrifying moments I was nearly taken. My own royal tent was breached, its ropes were cut, and the canvas shifted and sagged. I was surrounded by guards, dragged backward, shielded by men throwing their bodies into the confusion to keep me from being seen. I did not fight like a hero in that moment. I was 14. I did what a king my age could do. I stayed alive.
And that, strangely, was enough to change me, because nothing teaches you humility like realizing that a crown does not stop in enemy's hands. Nothing teaches you urgency like the knowledge that if you fall into captivity, your kingdom may fall with you. By morning, the camp was still standing, and I was still free. The Scots withdrew into the moors like mist drawn back into the hills. Officially, the campaign continued a little longer, but in truth, that night was its climax. We had not won, we had not forced Scotland to kneel, and the regime that ruled in my name had not gained the shining victory it wanted. In early 1328, my mother and Mortimer made the choice they had been moving towards. They agreed to the Treaty of Northampton. Under it, England recognized Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland and renounced the English claim to the Scottish throne. To some, it was peace. To many nobles, it was humiliation. And to me, it was a lesson in what happens when you are not the one making the decision. I remember the feeling of being a spectator to my own reign. I remember the frustration of watching a treaty take shape that I did not choose, yet would be remembered under my name. But I also remember what rose up in me afterwards. Not simply anger, not simply resentment, but a hard clarity. Never again would I be caught helpless in a camp. Never again would I rely on others to keep me from being seized in the darkness. Never again would I allow myself to be a king in name alone, protected by ceremony but exposed in reality. If I was going to wear this crown, I would learn the craft that made kings feared and respected in my time, the craft of war. Not war as spectacle, not war as stories told by bards, war as discipline, war as preparation, war as the ability to see a field and understand it before the enemy does, war as the ability to build an army that can hold when the world turns chaotic. And as the years moved forward, with Scotland unsettled and France watching from across the sea, that truth would become the foundation of everything I would do next. The boy who had nearly been taken in the night on the River Wear did not disappear. He learned. And the king that England would one day truly know began to form, quietly, stubbornly, out of the shame of that close call and the vow that followed it.
The night at Nottingham didn't end when Mortimer was taken from my mother's chambers. In some ways, it only began then. Because capturing a man is one thing, convincing a kingdom to accept that the rules have changed is something else entirely. Castles have doors and locks. Real power has habits, and habits don't break quietly. In the days that followed, I moved fast. A parliament was summoned, and word was carried across England that I would rule in my own right. Not later, not when the council decides I'm ready, now. I needed the realm to understand that what happened at Nottingham was not a private quarrel inside stone walls. It was a turning point. Mortimer was taken to London. There was no long trial in the way people imagine trials today. The accusations came quickly. Abuse of authority, corruption, the ruin of good men, the capture of power that didn't belong to him, and the verdict was never truly in doubt. In late November of 1330, Mortimer was executed at Tyburn. I did not go to watch with satisfaction. I did not feel triumph in it. I felt something colder and more permanent, the weight of consequence. Because when you remove a man like Mortimer, you don't just remove a person, you remove a system that has grown around him, beneficiaries, allies, people who quietly hoped he would keep their fortunes rising. That is why I moved carefully with my mother. Isabella was spared. England would not be healed by the public destruction of its queen, and I would not become the kind of ruler who cuts down his own blood to prove he can. But her political life was over. At first, she was kept at Windsor under strict watch. Later, she would live at Castle Rising in Norfolk, still treated with the dignity of her rank, still surrounded by servants, still expensive to maintain, but removed from the center where decisions were made. Some people expected to hate her, but hatred is too simple. She was my mother, and she had also been the force that toppled my father. She had done what she believed England required, and then she had gone further than any son should have to endure. In the end, I chose distance. It was the only kind of mercy that could keep the realm stable and keep my crown intact. Once Mortimer was gone and my mother was no longer ruling, the kingdom did not suddenly become peaceful. England was still bruised. Scotland was still a wound that refused to close. France was still watching. The treasury was still strained. And the nobles, always the nobles, were still measuring the young king, testing how much spine there was beneath the crown. So I began doing what kings must do when they want to survive. I built a government that worked. I gathered men I trusted. Some were older, experienced in administration. Some were soldiers with clear minds. I read accounts. I listened to complaints. I learned where money leaked away, where local officials grew lazy, where law was enforced and where it was ignored. I did not pretend to enjoy the details, but I respected them, because I had learned the hard way that a king who ignores the machinery of rule becomes dependent on whoever controls it. And as I studied England at home, a new storm began to form in the north. The Treaty of Northampton, signed when I was still under my mother's hand, had ended one phase of conflict with Scotland, but it had also created a bitter class of men within England. Lords who had once held lands across the border, lands they believed were rightfully theirs, found themselves dispossessed. They were called, with a brutal simplicity, the disinherited. To them, the treaty was not peace, it was theft made legal. They came to me with petitions, arguments, old promises, half-remembered rights. They wanted permission to go into Scotland and take back what they had lost. At first, I refused them openly. I knew what a full war in Scotland could cost. I knew England's wounds were still fresh. I also knew that if I officially sanctioned their invasion and it went wrong, the failure would be mine. But I also understood something else. Sometimes a king can decline with his lips and still leave a door ajar. So I refused in public, but I did not crush their plans. And in the summer of 1332, they acted on their own. They gathered ships on the English coast, crossed the sea, and landed in Scotland at Kinghorn and Fife, bringing with them a man whose name carried old claims and old grudges, Edward Balliol. Balliol was the son of John Balliol, the former king of Scotland whom my grandfather had once tried to control. To the disinherited, Balliol was a banner they could raise. To me, he was an opportunity. Dangerous, unpredictable, but useful if handled correctly. Their first success came quickly. At Duplin Moor, it was a sharp victory, the kind that convinces men that destiny is on their side. Not long after that, Balliol was crowned at Scone. Scotland, once again, was split between rival claims. From a distance, it might have looked like a sudden revival of English influence, but I was not fooled. A crown placed on a man's head does not mean a kingdom obeys him. Scotland had not forgotten Robert the Bruce. Scotland had not forgotten resistance. The Bruce faction would not simply vanish because Balliol had a ceremony. At Westminster, news arrived like thunder. England's nobles began pressing me to recognize Balliol and abandon the Treaty of Northampton entirely. Balliol, eager for my support, offered to become my vassal, willing to acknowledge that Scotland would hold its crown under English authority. That offer was tempting. For any English king, the idea of Scotland as a subordinate realm was an old dream, but dreams are expensive. I hesitated, not because I lacked ambition, but because I knew the danger of being drawn into a war where my ally could not hold his ground. And then Balliol proved exactly how weak he was. In late 1332, at Annan, he suffered a serious setback. He fled across the border into England, suddenly transformed from king to supplicant. It was one thing to let English lords gamble in Scotland on their own. It was another to allow an anointed, crowned claimant, one tied to English interests, to be chased into my realm like a beaten man. At that point, my choice narrowed. If I abandoned Balliol, I would look weak, unable to protect those who had acted in my orbit, unable to defend the northern lords who backed him. Scotland would interpret it as hesitation. England's nobility would interpret it as failure, and the whole northern frontier would become a playground for raiders again. So I committed. One of the first things I did was move the heart of government northward. I relocated the machinery of administration, officials, courts, accounts, to York. To money, it seemed extreme. To me, it was logical. If Scotland was the center of the crisis, then the king must be close enough to feel the heat and respond before it spreads. That decision was also a message. England would not treat this war as a distraction.
England would treat it as a priority. The next objective was obvious: Berwick. Berwick was wealthy, strategically placed, and symbolically important. Holding Berwick meant controlling a gateway between England and Scotland. If Berwick fell, Scottish resistance would be forced to answer. It would draw their armies south, and it would put the war on terms I could shape. In my command tent, over maps and reports, I began to prepare for what I sensed was coming. I did not crave a great battle for the sake of glory. I craved a situation where England's discipline could outweigh Scotland's numbers, where I could make the ground itself a weapon. I had learned from Weardale what it meant to be exposed. I had learned from Mortimer what it meant to let another man hold your power. Now I was determined to learn the deeper craft, how to shape a war so that it obeyed my rhythm instead of my enemy's. Berwick was tightening like a fist. The north wind cut across the camp. Banners snapped hard against their poles. Men checked bowstrings and tightened straps. Captains spoke in low voices. Scouts rode out and returned with the kind of news that makes the air feel heavier. Scotland was coming, and I was no longer a boy watching others decide what England would do. I was the king who would decide where England stood and whether the hill beneath our feet would become our shield.
Berwick upon Tweed sat at the edge of two worlds. An old, stubborn town of stone and river and sea wind, and a symbol that neither England nor Scotland could afford to ignore. In the spring of 1333, as my siege tightened around its walls, I could feel the north itself resisting me. Cold gusts off the water, rain that turned earthworks into heavy mud, and that particular silence you get before something decisive happens. Berwick wasn't just a prize, it was a message. If I held it, the border would lean toward England again. If I lost it, every lord from the Marches to York would question whether my reign had truly begun at all. Inside my camp, the work never stopped. Men raised palisades, dug trenches, laid down timber paths across the wet ground. Messengers arrived with reports. Scouts brought back sightings. Captains argued in low voices over the safest lines of approach. And while the siege engines were prepared, I prepared something else, something more important than wood and rope. I prepared the ground. I had learned painfully that war is not only about courage, war is about where you stand and what you force the enemy to do. At Weardale, I had come too close to being taken in the night because I did not yet understand how quickly control can vanish. I promised myself I would never be that exposed again. And now, with Scotland marching south to relieve Berwick, I could finally shape the kind of fight I wanted. The news reached us the way a storm announces itself, first as rumor, then as certainty. The Guardian of Scotland, Sir Archibald Douglas, was bringing a large army, larger than mine. Some said twice my number. I didn't need an exact count to understand the problem. If I met him on open ground and he could use his mass freely, the day could go against me. So I chose Halidon Hill. It rose just a short distance northwest of Berwick, high enough to command the surrounding land. From its crest, you could see the town, the river, the coast, everything a commander needs to read the battlefield like a page. And more importantly, it forced any army coming to us to climb. Climbing changes a man. It steals speed, it breaks formation, it drains breath. A line that looks solid on flat ground becomes uneven on a slope, and if that line is forced to keep moving under pressure, it begins to bend. On the 19th of July in the year 1333, Douglas came. I remember standing on the hilltop and watching the Scottish host form in the distance, banners snapping, spear points catching light, the dark mass of men shifting like a living thing. The wind was hard that day. It tugged at cloaks and standards, and it carried the salt taste of the sea. My own force was smaller, but it was prepared, and it was placed where it needed to be. I formed my army with clear intent. Dismounted men-at-arms in the center, steady, armored, built to hold, and long bowmen on the flanks. Many on the continent mocked the English bow as a peasant's weapon. They preferred crossbows and heavy cavalry, the polished tools of noble war. But I had seen what disciplined archers could do, and I trusted what we had become good at, repeating a deadly action with calm precision. When Douglas advanced, he had little choice.
Berwick's defenders had made their own ultimatum. If relief did not come, they would surrender. Time pressed him toward battle. And so, despite the disadvantage, the Scots began to climb. At first, it was almost quiet, just the sound of feet on grass and soil, the flutter of cloth, the low murmur of men trying to hold their nerve. Then my archers began their work. I don't describe it for spectacle. I describe it because it was the moment I understood the longbow not as a weapon, but as a system. A crossbow can hit hard, but it takes time to reload. A longbow in trained hands creates a rhythm. Draw, anchor, release, again and again like a drumbeat. And on that slope, with the Scots compressing as they climbed, that rhythm found its mark. Douglas's men tried to keep formation, tried to push through it, but arrows don't negotiate with pride. The climb slowed them, the pressure tightened them, and the hill robbed them of the momentum they needed. By the time the front ranks reached my center, they were already exhausted, already disordered, already carrying the cost of the ascent. My men-at-arms held, the flanks kept firing, and then, inevitably, the Scottish line began to break. When it broke, it did what armies always do in that moment. It turned from a wall into a stream. Men moved downhill, away from the high ground, away from the sustained pressure. My forces advanced carefully, maintaining order rather than chasing blindly. Discipline matters most when victory tempts you into carelessness. By the end of the day, Halidon Hill belonged to England. Douglas was dead. Several Scottish earls fell with him, and Berwick, seeing no rescue now, soon surrendered. Standing on that hill afterward, looking down toward the town and the sea, I felt something settle in me. Not joy, not cruelty, something quieter, but stronger. Confidence. Because for the first time in my life, I had won a decisive battle as a king who was truly in command. Not a boy being carried by his mother's decisions, not a youth protected by older men, but a monarch shaping the field, choosing the ground, and forcing events to follow my design. The political consequences came quickly. Scottish magnates began to submit, at least outwardly. Berwick, rich and strategic, became an English garrison town. Balliol, restored again, was brought forward as king, and he promised what he always promised when he needed me, that Scotland would acknowledge my overlordship. In June of 1334 at Newcastle, Balliol performed homage to me. It was a ceremony heavy with symbolism, a Scottish claimant kneeling before an English king, acknowledging that his crown would exist under my authority. For a moment, it looked like the dream of my grandfather, Edward Longshanks, had been resurrected. David II, the Bruce heir, fled to France. Scottish resistance seemed scattered, and for a brief time, it felt as if the north had been settled. But peace in Scotland is often an illusion you can only see from a distance. Balliol was not Robert the Bruce. He did not have the weight, the loyalty, or the instinct to hold a divided kingdom. No sooner had I propped him up than resistance rose again. In the summer of 1334 and beyond, he faltered. He fled. He begged. And each time, I faced the same decision. Either abandon him and accept that Scotland would remain unstable, or intervene again and again, spending men and money on a crown that could not stand on its own. So I intervened. Late in 1334 and into 1335, I campaigned north again. In 1336, I pushed even into the Highlands, territory that felt less like a kingdom, more like the edge of the world. Narrow passes, wind-driven mist, rock and heather, and endless distance. It wasn't glamorous warfare. It was hard marching, harsh weather, and the constant problem of supply. And still the deeper truth remained. Even when I won ground, holding it was something else. Yet I was not blind to what I had achieved. Even without completely subduing Scotland, I had changed England's position on the border in a way it hadn't been changed for decades. Berwick, most importantly, was now ours. It would remain a key English stronghold for a long time. The northern lords felt the crown was present again, not distant and passive as it had been in my father's reign. And beyond England, Europe began to look at us differently. Halidon Hill did something that speeches could not do. It proved that English arms could defeat a larger force through discipline and tactical sense. It proved that the longbow, used properly, could reshape battle itself. It proved that I, Edward, was not simply a name on a throne.
but victory has a way of attracting new problems. Even as I fought in the north, I could feel another front forming, one far larger than Scotland and far more dangerous to the future of my dynasty. Across the sea, France watched every movement, and Scotland, bound to France through old alliances, was never truly alone in its resistance. By 1337, it was becoming clear that I could not keep my full attention on Scotland forever, not while France remained a threat and my lands in Aquitaine remained vulnerable. The north could consume a king's reign if he let it, and I was beginning to see my reign not as a series of reactions, but as a story I intended to write. When I looked at the map, I saw Scotland as a wound that must be kept from reopening. But when I looked across the channel, I saw something else, an argument of blood and crowns that had never truly been resolved. Halidon Hill had given me confidence, Berwick had given me leverage, and the years of campaign had given my kingdom something equally important: experience. Men who knew how to march, how to build houses, how to hold lines in disciplined formations. I had learned to use terrain as a weapon. I had learned to make an enemy climb into disadvantage. I had learned the value of rhythm and patience. And I sensed deeply that these lessons would soon be needed on a far greater stage, because the next war would not be fought on the moors of the north.
France was never far from my thoughts, even when my boots were caked with northern mud and my banners snapped in the wind above Bedwick. It was always there, across the water, across the treaties, across the old feudal knot that tied the kings of England to lands in France. Aquitaine was English in practice, French in theory, and that contradiction sat like a blade between two crowns. The deeper wound, though, began years earlier, when the direct line of French kings failed. In February of 1328, my uncle Charles IV died. He left no son to inherit. France faced a choice, and choices like that decide the fate of centuries. By blood, my claim was strong. I was the grandson of Philip IV through my mother, Isabella. In another world, another set of laws, another set of fears, France might have considered me. But the French nobility did not want an English king on the throne of Paris. They did not want England and France bound under one crown, even if that crown wore both lilies and lions. So they chose Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI. In England, my mother and Mortimer protested briefly, but they knew reality when they saw it. And in the spring of 1329, I crossed to Amiens and performed homage to Philip, because I still held lands in France, and those lands under feudal custom demanded that gesture. The world called it protocol. I felt it as humiliation. A king kneeling to another king is not a small thing, even when the kneeling is dressed in ceremony and incense. It teaches you how fragile titles can be when land is involved, and it plants a seed you can never fully uproot, the desire to erase that moment. For several years I held that seed in silence. Scotland consumed my attention. England needed stability. But across the Channel, the relationship between France and England grew colder, more brittle, until it finally snapped. In May of 1337, Philip VI declared that he was confiscating Aquitaine. Just like that, by royal decision, backed by French power, my lands were declared forfeit. It was not simply a territorial dispute. It was an announcement that France believed I could be pushed, humiliated, and stripped, and that I would accept it. I did not accept it. But I also understood the practical problem immediately. Aquitaine was far away, difficult to supply, and vulnerable. If I wanted to protect it, I couldn't fight only in the southwest of France. I needed leverage. I needed pressure closer to Paris, closer to the French king's heartlands, where every loss would sting and every threat would force him to respond. To do that, I needed to get an army onto the continent and keep it there. England's merchant fleet was growing, yes, but transporting a full medieval army, men, horses, supplies, siege gear, was never simple. It was not a matter of a single crossing. It was a constant demand for ships, ports, money, and coordination. So I looked where my grandfather had looked decades earlier, to the Low Countries and the princes of the empire. Those lands were wealthy, politically fragmented, and strategically placed along the northern edge of France. Their towns lived on trade, especially cloth, and cloth depended heavily on English wool. That meant I had a kind of bargaining power, not the power of a sword, but the power of supply. In 1337, I sent envoys across the sea, men I trusted, men who could negotiate and threaten and flatter as needed. Bishop Henry Burgershaz of Lincoln was one of them, as was William Montagu, my close ally. They moved through courts in Hainault, Brabant, and elsewhere, offering alliances, payments, and mutual advantage. And slowly, an alliance took shape. It was impressive on paper. Troops promised, ships promised, support promised. But alliances in that world were not built on friendship. They were built on money. By the end of that first year of diplomacy, the commitments I had made were enormous, sums that far exceeded what my ordinary income could cover.
To modern ears, the amounts sound like accounting lines. To my treasury, they were mountains. So I borrowed. I borrowed from Italian merchant bankers who could move money across Europe like water through channels. I raised taxes, and I did something that would shape England long after my wars were forgotten. I turned to Parliament. Kings had summoned Parliament before, of course, but war forced the relationship to deepen. When a king needs money, he cannot simply demand it endlessly without consequence. He must ask, and when he asks, the political nation answers with conditions, grievances, and demands of their own. It is easy to imagine Parliament as an obstacle, but it was also a tool, a way to harness the realm's resources through consent, and to tie the kingdom closer to the crown through shared effort. That is what war did. It forced England to become more organized, more financially capable, more politically conscious. In July of 1338, I finally sailed for the continent myself. We passed Antwerp and moved into the Low Countries. The scale of Europe hit me differently there. England was powerful, yes, but Europe was a mosaic of rulers, cities, princes, bishops, and trading powers. Every alliance was a door, and every door had a price. In early September, I met Louis of Bavaria, the Holy Roman Emperor, at Koblenz. It was a meeting heavy with symbolism. He appointed me Vicar General of the Empire, an honorary position meant to raise my legitimacy and, in theory, open the Empire's resources to my cause. In reality, it was part of the diplomatic dance. Titles traded for money, promises traded for influence. By the spring of 1339, I was ready to campaign in northern France. But I ran into a frustration that would define much of my early war. Philip refused to fight me on my terms. He avoided direct battle. He maneuvered, withdrew, refused to give me the set-piece victory I wanted. We came close to contact near La Capelle in October, but it was not the decisive clash I had hoped for. It felt like trying to seize smoke with your hands. And it was in that frustration, combined with the growing stakes and the advice of new allies, that I made a decision that would echo through centuries. If Philip would not fight me as a mere duke defending his lands, then I would make the war out something larger. In January of 1340, I began to use the title of King of France. I adopted the arms. I declared in effect that I was not resisting Philip's power, I was challenging his legitimacy. Some will call it ambition, some will call it arrogance, but to me it was also strategy. A claim to the throne gave me a higher narrative. It gave me a cause that could justify deeper involvement in France. It gave my allies something grander to support, and it told the French nobility that the conflict would not end with minor concessions. It would end with one king prevailing. Of course, a title alone does not win wars. A banner does not seize ports. A claim does not stop ships. And by that point, the war was shifting towards the sea. Philip had built up a fleet, reinforced by allies including Castile. The goal was clear: challenge English control of the Channel, threaten England's southern coasts, and cut my ability to send men and supplies across the water. If the French controlled the Channel, everything else I planned would collapse. So the question became, could England win a war at sea the way it was beginning to win wars on land? I prepared and I sailed. The Channel was grey and restless. The wind carried salt and uncertainty. But when the horizon finally revealed the enemy fleet, dense, anchored, arranged like a wall, I saw something else too. An opportunity. The French ships were packed tightly in this wind estuary near Sluice, chained and tied, meant to block passage and overwhelm any attacker who dared approach. But that density was also a weakness. It meant the battle would be fought at close quarters, where archers could fire from decks into crowded enemy ships, and where English discipline could turn chaos into advantage. As my fleet advanced, I watched the men around me, bowmen with bracers and quiet faces, sailors with hands hardened by rope, knights in mail gripping rails to steady themselves. Their movements were controlled. No one was shouting for glory. They were preparing to survive. And that is often the difference between victory and disaster. I stood on deck and felt the ship rise and fall with the waves beneath my boots. I could smell tar and wet timber. I could hear rope creak as it tightened under strain, and I understood with sharp clarity that this battle was not just about France. It was about England's ability to remain England. If we won, the Channel would be ours, England would be protected, and my war on the continent could continue. If we lost, England would be exposed, and every plan, every alliance, every sacrifice of Parliament and Treasury would unravel. So as the distance closed, as the enemy ships grew from silhouettes into walls of wood and cloth and iron, I did not think of romance or legend. I thought of necessity. And I gave the order to press forward. Because the war I had begun was now too large to step away from. The crown I wore demanded that I either seize control of the sea, or surrender control of everything else. The fleets drew closer, the air thickened with mist, and the Channel itself seemed to lean in, as if it wanted to witness what kind of king I truly was.
Midsummer's Day, the 24th of June, 1340. I remember the morning air before I remember the fighting. The sea off the Flemish coast was a cold slate under a low sky, and the wind carried that sharp salt taste that makes you feel smaller than you want to admit. Ahead of us, the French fleet sat packed in the Zwin estuary near Sluice, ship against ship, like a floating wall. Their banners, lilies and allied colors, snapped above the timber masts as if the whole horizon had been stitched with cloth. For weeks we'd known what this moment meant. If France controlled the Channel, England would be exposed. Not only my ports, but my plans, my armies, my allies, my claim. Everything would be at the mercy of the tide and the enemy's ships. A king can lose a battle on land and rebuild. A king who loses the sea loses the road between his realm and his war. I walked the deck before the first arrows flew. The planks were slick with spray. Ropes creaked under strain. Men spoke in low voices, checking knots and bowstrings, adjusting straps and bracers with the calm rhythm of people who understand that panic is a luxury. When the distance closed, I saw the weakness inside the French strength.
Their ships were crowded together, chained and tied to hold position, meant to trap and crush anyone who came near. But packed ships create packed decks, and packed decks invite one weapon more than any other: the longbow. On land, my archers had already begun to change what battle meant. At sea, I intended to make the same discipline count. The French favored crossbows, powerful, yes, but slow to reload, awkward in the press of bodies. A longbow, in trained hands, doesn't just shoot, it sustains pressure. It creates a beat, draw, anchor, release, again and again, until the enemy loses shape. I gave the order to press in close. Some captains would have kept distance, traded shots, hoped the sea would choose for them. I could not afford hope. I needed decision. So we advanced until the enemy's ships were no longer a distant line, but real timber and iron in front of us, close enough to see faces through the haze. When our first volleys went out, the sound wasn't like thunder. It was sharper than that, like the air itself cracking. Arrows rose and fell in dark arcs, and on the French decks men lifted shields, ducked behind pavises, shifted in tight spaces where there was nowhere clean to run. Their return fire came back, bolts snapping through mist, but slower and less steady. Then the battle became what all medieval sea battles become when ships are tied together: a struggle for decks. Grappling hooks flew, ropes snapped tight, hulls ground against each other with the weight of two moving worlds. You could feel it in your feet when the ships met, a jolt traveling up through the timber, through your bones. Planks were pushed across. Men tested footing before crossing, because on a rolling deck, one careless step is not bravery, it's waste. I watched my men move the way I had trained them to move, with purpose and restraint, not charging like a storybook hero, but stepping forward behind shields, keeping balance, letting weight and momentum work instead of theatrics. The sea punished exaggeration. So did armor. Everything had to be real. Smoke began to gather as the hours passed. Pitch pots burned. Lantern light and daylight blurred into a dirty haze that made it hard to see more than a few yards. Sometimes you fought by silhouette. Sometimes you fought by sound. Boots on planks, ropes screaming under tension, the sudden hush when a deck cleared and the wind rushed back in. At one point, as the battle tightened around us, I felt a sharp impact in my thigh. An arrow, its force more shocking than its pain at first, found a gap or an angle. My body reacted before my mind did. My hand clamped the rail. A guard's arm came up to steady me as the ship rocked. I did not go down. I won't pretend it was courage alone. It was stubbornness and the understanding that a king's posture can hold an army together. If my men saw me fall, even for a moment, uncertainty would spread faster than fear. So I stayed upright, shifted my weight carefully, and kept giving orders with the same calm I had before the wound. The fighting continued. The French line, so confident in its wall, began to fracture. Ships that could not maneuver became obstacles to each other. Ropes that were meant to trap us trapped them as well. Some decks fell quiet under English control. Others drifted, damaged, their sails hanging wrong in the wind. By late afternoon, the shape of the day was clear. The French fleet had suffered catastrophic losses. Many thousands of men, sailors and soldiers, lost their lives in those hours, and most of the French ships were destroyed or taken. It was not simply a victory, it was the kind of victory that changes what is possible. When the smoke thinned and the wind cleared the stench from the air, I stood at the rail and looked out over a sea littered with debris, broken spars, and torn cloth. The sun was lowering, turning the water dull gold beneath the haze. My leg throbbed, my arms felt heavy, and yet the strongest feeling was not triumph, it was relief. Because the channel, our lifeline, was secure. England's southern coast could breathe. My armies could cross to the continent without sailing through a noose. My war with France, my claim, my strategy, none of it could survive without that. In the days after Sluys, the men around me spoke of glory and providence. Let them. I knew the harder truth. Victory at sea is expensive. Ships must be repaired, crews must be paid, allies must be kept loyal, and behind every banner snapping in the wind is a ledger waiting to be balanced. By the autumn of that year, the war's cost had begun to crush the machinery of government. The loans, the subsidies, the promises I had made on the continent, everything demanded coin, and coin demanded order. So I returned to England in November, and I did not return with ceremony. I came quietly, almost in secret, because I needed to see the state of my government before it prepared masks for my arrival. A king who only arrives with trumpets never learns the truth. I wanted the truth. London greeted me with fog and cold stone. In the corridors of Westminster, the air felt heavy with candle smoke and anxiety. Clerks moved too quickly. Officials avoided my eyes. In the Treasury, numbers did not add up the way they should. Accounts were confused, delayed, sometimes simply missing. I was furious, not in a childish way, not with shouting and rage for its own sake, but with the sharp anger of a man who knows what the war requires and cannot tolerate incompetence beneath him. We won the sea. We could not now be defeated by our own disorder. The confrontation that followed shook the court. Some ministers tried to defend themselves. Others tried to hide behind procedure. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, was among those who resisted my anger. He was no weak man, and he did not bend easily. In truth, he believed he was protecting the realm from a king's temper. In his mind, perhaps, he was the final barrier between order and royal excess. But I was not looking for permission. I was looking for accountability. For weeks, the political relationship between crown and churchmen and government was strained. At times, it felt as if the political nation might split again, just when unity was most needed. And I understood, even in my anger, that I could not afford a civil struggle while France remained my enemy. So we did what medieval power often does when it wants to survive. We negotiated, we adjusted, we made concessions without admitting weakness. By the following year, a reconciliation of sorts was reached. Not friendship, never that, but a working peace. Stratford remained influential. My government steadied. The accounts were tightened. The court learned that I would not be treated like a distant symbol while others handled the kingdom as if it were their private purse. Still, even as I fought to keep England's finances from collapsing, the war itself refused to wait. Scotland had not disappeared. While I had been in France, Scotland moved again. The conflict there never truly ended. It only quieted when other dangers pulled my attention away. And now, with David II growing into his own claim and his supporters regaining confidence, the northern border began to flare again. So, the victory at sea did not deliver me a life of ease. It delivered me the ability to keep fighting, and the obligation to choose where and how. That is what Sluys gave me. Not peace, but freedom of movement. Not an end, but a foundation. In the quiet moments after the storm of that year, when I stood alone in a chamber lit by a single candle, the smell of smoke still caught in my hair, I understood something that would follow me for the rest of my reign. A king cannot win only with courage. He must win with ships and coin, with alliances and administration, with discipline on the battlefield and discipline in the treasury. The sea had proven I could command war. England now demanded I command the state. And as the next crises gathered at the horizon, Scotland to the north, France across the water.
When we landed in Normandy in the summer of 1346, the air smelled of salt, wet rope, and turned earth. Like the coast itself knew an army was stepping onto it. It was the 12th of July. Dawn was still low and cold on the water, and the English ships rolled gently offshore, while men climbed down into shallow surf, holding shield high to keep powder-dry essentials from the spray, guiding horses carefully so they wouldn't panic on the shifting sand. It wasn't glorious, it was practical. War begins with logistics long before it begins with legend. I had brought a force large enough to matter, several thousand men-at-arms, a strong body of archers, and the supply trains needed to keep them moving. My intention was not a neat, polite siege. My intention was a chevauchée, to move fast, to strike where the French king could not ignore it, and to force him into a decision. Normandy in summer can look like a painted world. Fields, hedgerows, stone churches rising above villages. But when an army moves through it, the landscape becomes a map, and every road is a question. Do you take it quickly, or do you take it safely? Do you avoid towns, or do you seize them to feed your men? Do you stop and consolidate, or do you keep moving and risk being caught? For weeks we pushed inland, taking what the land offered and keeping our column disciplined. Scouts rode ahead, messengers rode back, captains kept spacing in the ranks, wagons creaked over rutted tracks. I learned long ago that an army isn't simply a crowd of armed men. It's a living machine. If you let it loosen, it breaks. The first major prize came quickly, Caen. On the 26th of July, we captured the city. Caen was wealthy and strategically important, an urban heart of Normandy. The fall of Caen shook France because it proved we were not merely raiding the edges. We could strike deep, take a major town, and keep marching. But I did not come to settle into Normandy. I came to move. As we advanced, word reached me that Philip VI was gathering his forces. He was furious, fiercely, personally, because every mile we marched made him look weaker. And by mid-August, his army was large, larger than mine, perhaps twice my strength, depending on the day and the muster. France had knights, infantry, crossbowmen, an impressive host by any measure. So I did what I had learned to do. I refused to fight the enemy's ideal battle. Instead of approaching Paris like a fool in love with his own boldness, I skirted the city and turned north. My goal was to reach Flanders and link up with allies there, but the deeper purpose was simple: keep Philip chasing me, keep him uncertain, and look for ground where my army, smaller but disciplined, could turn that disadvantage into victory. The march north was exhausting. Rivers blocked us, bridges were destroyed or guarded. We crossed where we could, sometimes at fords, sometimes by building makeshift passages, sometimes by sheer persistence. One crossing, near the Somme, was especially critical. The landscape there is treacherous, marsh and low water, mud that can swallow a horse's hoof. But we forced our way through because delay would have meant being trapped between river and enemy. By late August, Philip was close. And then, on the 26th of August, we reached a place called Crécy and Ponthieu. When I learned how near the French were, I chose my ground immediately. I took the higher slope on the right bank of a small river, the May, and I formed my army with the same principle that had served me at Halidon Hill. Make the enemy climb, make him compress, make him spend his strength reaching you. My force was arranged in 3 main divisions: men-at-arms in the center, dismounted to hold firm, archers on the flanks positioned to create crossing fire and to punish any attempt to attack the center without losing shape. And with me was my son, Edward, still a teenager, already carrying the pressure of command. The world would later remember him as the Black Prince. In that moment, he was simply my heir, standing in the line where fate would test him. The French came late in the day. That mattered. An army that attacks late after long marching carries fatigue into the fight. Philip's men were eager, angry, and certain that numbers and cavalry would win what they believed was theirs by right. But the battlefield does not care about right. The French began with their crossbowmen, many of them Genoese, moving forward with pavises raised. Crossbows are powerful, but their weakness is time. They reload slowly. And that afternoon the weather shifted. A brief rain shower dampened strings and made the ground slick. English longbowmen could protect their strings more easily, keep rhythm. The French crossbowmen struggled to match it. Then the longbow spoke. Volley after volley, the English arrows fell into the advancing lines. The Genoese crossbowmen began to falter, and as they retreated, they collided with French cavalry pressing forward behind them, because in the chaos of battle, one line rarely understands what the next line is doing. Philip tried to force victory through mounted charges. Knights spurred uphill into a storm of arrows. Horses slowed, bunched, turned aside, or lost momentum in the mud and press of bodies. The charge, so terrifying on open flat ground, became a series of broken attempts, each one paying a cost before it even reached my men-at-arms. When the French finally hit our center, my infantry was waiting. Shields up, feet planted, no panic. We absorbed the pressure and held. Crécy was not a single clash. It was a grinding sequence, attack after attack, France trying to overwhelm us through repetition, England responding with discipline and position, and as darkness fell, the French began to withdraw. By dawn on the 27th, the field was ours. The victory was decisive, not because it ended the war at once, but because it changed the psychology of the conflict. France had been defeated in a direct contest despite superior numbers. The longbow, once dismissed, had proven itself again, and on that field something else appeared too. Early cannon, small and crude, not yet a war winner, but a sign that warfare itself was evolving. After Crécy, I did not chase Paris. I did not waste time seeking another dramatic moment. Northern France was exposed now, so I turned toward the coast and laid siege to Calais on the 3rd of September. Calais was more than a town. It was a door, a port, a foothold that could tie England to the continent with a chain of timber and salt water. If I could take it, I could hold a permanent base for future campaigns. If I failed, the opportunity might not come again. The siege would last nearly a year of trenches, palisades, blockade at sea, winter suffering, and endless endurance. But even as we tightened our grip around Calais, the war's other fronts refused to stay quiet. Scotland, as always, watched for England's distraction. In the autumn of 1346, David II, King of Scotland, invaded northern England, encouraged by France to honor their alliance. He believed my absence in France gave him a chance to strike. He was wrong. Near Durham, at a place called Neville's Cross, English forces met the Scots and defeated them, and in that battle, David was captured.
So by the time I stood outside Calais, deep in siege lines, I held something extraordinary. Scotland's king in captivity and France's king already beaten in the field. It was an advantage that should have forced the world to take notice. In August of 1347, Calais finally surrendered. The keys were brought out, the gates opened, and England walked into the town. I entered slowly, not as a man drunk on conquest, but as a king securing a foothold that would shape centuries. Calais would remain English for more than 200 years. That alone tells you what kind of prize it was. When I returned to England later that year, I could have believed the war was nearly won. Cressy and Calais in France, a captured Scottish king in the north, my fortune seemed almost untouchable. But history is never gentle with men who believe they are untouchable. Even at the height of victory, a shadow was already moving across Europe. A sickness, a catastrophe that did not care about banners, treaties, or crowns. I did not know it yet, not fully. Not in the way you know a storm when you see clouds on the horizon. But it was coming, and soon it would test my reign in a way no battlefield ever could.
There are enemies you can meet on a field and measure with banners, armor, and numbers. And then there are enemies you never see coming, because they arrive on the smallest backs imaginable, hidden in the seams of trade, riding in the shadows of ships. The plague that people later called the Black Death did not announce itself with a declaration. It drifted. In 1347, it moved into Europe through the ports of the Mediterranean. Merchants carried it unknowingly. Sailors carried it. It traveled in the fleas that lived on rats that thrived wherever grain and cargo were stored, wherever ships and warehouses offered warmth and darkness. It was the kind of threat a medieval mind struggled to understand, because it had no army, no king, no border to defend against. By late summer of 1348, the sickness reached England. At first, it appeared in the ports, quietly, like a rumor you can't quite confirm. Then it moved inward along roads and rivers. By October, London was recording cases, and the city's familiar noise began to thin. Markets slowed, streets emptied, people stopped gathering where they once crowded together, not because they had laws or science to guide them, but because fear itself was guidance enough. London under plague was a different creature. The Thames fog hung low, and the smoke from hearths and forges mixed with it until the air felt heavy. Bells tolled more often, doors stayed shut longer. When people passed each other in lanes, they did it with the awkward distance of those who no longer trusted breath. The symptoms were terrifying: fever, weakness, swelling. People spoke of buboes, painful lumps that appeared under the arms and the groin, at the neck. They didn't know what caused them. They didn't understand infection. They only understood that once a household was struck, the odds were cruel. And then the sickness came for my family. News reached me from Bordeaux that my daughter, Joan, had died. She was 14. A king can endure many things. He can endure defeat if he has the strength to rebuild. He can endure rebellion if he has the nerve to face it. But losing a child is a kind of wound that doesn't behave like war. You can't negotiate with it. You can't outright it. You can't conquer it. I remember sitting very still as the message was read, not because I felt nothing, but because I felt too much. In a court full of watching eyes, a king learns early that the face must not collapse, even when the heart does. Joan's death was not just grief, it was a warning. If a princess could fall, so could anyone. The crown did not protect you from what could not be seen. So I left London. Like many rulers after me would do, I withdrew to less crowded places, trying to reduce exposure. You could call it medieval quarantine. We did not have the language for it, but we understood the instinct. Distance might preserve life. For a time, governance became scattered. Planned assemblies were delayed. Courts were adjourned. Officials did what they could, but the scale of the catastrophe was larger than any system built for ordinary years. Across England, the dead were buried quickly, often in mass graves, because the living could not keep up. Priests and attendants did their work with a grim rhythm, moving through foggy streets with carts and covered bundles, trying to maintain dignity when the numbers made dignity difficult. People prayed, of course. They lit candles, sought saints, carried relics. That is what frightened societies do when they cannot explain what is happening. But prayer alone could not solve a plague moving through fleas and breath in crowded households. What mattered, more than any royal speech, was organization. When the first wave began to ease, another crisis surfaced immediately, one that threatened to break the kingdom even after the sickness passed: labor. So many people had died that fields went unplowed, workshops stood empty, harvests were threatened. The surviving workers, now fewer and more valuable, demanded higher wages. Lords and landowners, desperate to keep estates functioning, faced a new reality. The balance of power between employer and laborer was shifting.
From medieval society built on rigid hierarchies, that shift felt like a crack in the world. In the summer of 1349, my government issued the Ordinance of Laborers. Then in 1351, it was strengthened into what became known as the Statute of Laborers. The goal was straightforward: fix wages at their pre-plague levels and compel able-bodied people to work. To modern ears, it can sound harsh, and it was, but it was also an attempt to prevent the economy from spiraling into collapse. Without some form of wage control, the kingdom risked chaos, fields left uncultivated, prices rising, resentment exploding between classes already strained by death. The statute did not erase the tension. In many places it inflamed it, but it did something else of lasting importance. It expanded the role of local law enforcement under the crown. Justices of the peace existed before, but in the years after the plague they became more significant. They were the ones expected to enforce wage regulations, settle disputes, punish those who refused to work under the new rules. That meant the crown's authority, already strong, now pressed deeper into local life. In a strange way, the plague accelerated state building, not because we wanted it to, but because disaster demands structure. When the world breaks, people either organize or they fall. Around the same time, we also reformed coinage. In 1351, changes were introduced that included new gold coins and a new silver coin known as the groat. Money matters in war and recovery. A stable coinage helps trade resume, helps taxes flow, helps the machinery of the realm function. I was not a king who loved the minutiae of administration. I never pretended to be. My strength was choosing capable men and trusting them to do their work, then holding them accountable when the realm required it. In those years, officials like John Thoresby and William Shershell helped steer reforms that kept England functioning when so much of Europe staggered. And while England tried to recover, war did not disappear. It only waited. The truce I had arranged with France in late 1347 held longer than it might have otherwise, largely because the plague disrupted everything: armies, trade, logistics, the ability to campaign. When both sides are counting graves, even kings hesitate to march. But the conflict was not resolved. It was paused. In 1350, my old enemy Philip VI died, and his son, John II, took the French throne. Jean was ambitious, proud, and determined to restore French strength. Yet in the early 1350s, I could not immediately strike again with full force. France had a growing alliance with Castile, and Castilian ships threatened the Channel. Without secure sea lanes, even my victories could be strangled by distance. So the war shifted into smaller conflicts: Brittany, local disputes, proxy fights, while the larger game waited for the right moment. Meanwhile, England tried to breathe again. Some markets reopened, some villages returned to their rhythms. But the land was not the same. The absence of so many lives changed everything: how labor was valued, how people saw authority, how willing they were to accept old restraints. Even when the worst had passed, the memory of it remained like a shadow in the corner of every hall. And through it all, I kept ruling, not as a conqueror this time, but as a stabilizer. I had won at Crécy, I had taken Calais, I had secured a foothold that would outlast me by centuries. Yet the plague reminded me that triumph is not the same as control. You can dominate a battlefield and still be powerless against a sickness carried by a flea. In the quiet nights away from London, with candles low and the wind brushing at shutters, I learned a different kind of kingship. A kingship not measured by banners on foreign walls, but by whether your people still have fields to harvest, coins to trade, courts to settle disputes, and enough order to prevent fear from becoming collapse. The Black Death did not break England, but it did change England. It tested the strength of our institutions and exposed the weaknesses of our society. It forced me to govern with a steadier hand, to accept that a king's duty is not only to fight wars, but to hold the realm together when the enemy has no face. And when Europe finally began to lift its head again, when ships sailed more confidently, when armies could once more be supplied, when kings could once more plan campaigns, the war with France was waiting, exactly as it had been before. Only now we were all living in a world with fewer people, sharper tensions, and a deeper understanding that death can come from anywhere, even from the smallest shadows.
After the Black Death loosened its grip, Europe didn't suddenly become peaceful. It simply became quieter and more tense. Fewer voices in the streets, fewer hands in the fields, and far less patience among kings who believed the world still owed them victories. For me, the question was never whether the war with France would return. It was when, and under what conditions. England had survived the plague, but survival came with a new kind of fragility. Every campaign now demanded careful planning, steady money, and the discipline to choose battles that would actually matter. By the middle of the 1350s, I decided to press our advantage again. The plan was ambitious, a double strike. One effort would threaten northern France from our base at Calais, and another would push hard from Gascony in the southwest. If France could be forced to fight in two directions at once, their strength would stretch then, and that was exactly what I needed. Yet, as so often happened in my reign, the north refused to stay quiet. Scotland still had the habit of testing England whenever my gaze turned south. So when trouble flared on the border again, I did what a king must do. I turned back. In the winter of 1355 into 1356, I led what would become my last major campaign into Scotland, restoring order along the frontier and reminding our enemies that England could still answer quickly. But while I was occupied, my son, the Black Prince, took center stage in France.
In the autumn of 1355, he sailed to Bordeaux, bringing an army that was not enormous by continental standards, but was sharp, mobile, and experienced. He moved with the kind of speed and intent that had defined my own earlier campaigns. He raided inland toward Toulouse, not to conquer everything in his path, but to apply pressure, economic, psychological, political, so that French authority would feel unstable even far from Paris. That first season ended without a single decisive battle, but it set the tone. The Black Prince had learned the same lesson I had. A campaign is not only about taking towns, it is about controlling tempo, forcing the enemy to react, and choosing where the war will truly be decided. The real test came the following year. In the summer of 1356, the Black Prince launched a long chevauchée through central France. His force moved fast, striking deep into territory that had not expected English banners. Towns and storehouses were put under pressure, roads disrupted, and France's confidence shaken. When he turned back toward Bordeaux, he did it with purpose, keeping his army intact, refusing to be pinned down on unfavorable ground. But King Jean II of France was determined to stop him. Jean gathered a larger army and moved to intercept. He believed perhaps that my son would be easier to break than I had been. He believed that numbers and noble cavalry would restore French honor, and he believed the moment demanded a direct challenge. That decision led us to Poitiers. On the 19th of September 1356, the two forces met near the town. The landscape mattered: lanes, hedges, uneven ground, all the small features that can turn a proud charge into a crowded struggle. The English, outnumbered, did what we had learned to do best. They chose a position that punished the enemy's strength. Archers were placed where they could fire effectively. Men-at-arms held firm in the center. Mobility was preserved for the moment it would matter most. The fighting was hard, but the pattern was familiar. French attacks pressed forward and then faltered under sustained pressure and difficult terrain. The English line held. A feigned withdrawal and swift counter-moves disrupted the French rhythm. And as the day tightened into its decisive moments, something extraordinary happened. Jean II, King of France, was captured. It is hard to describe the shock of that news without exaggeration. Victories are one thing, capturing a king is another. A king is not simply a man, he's a nation's symbol, a nation's legitimacy, a nation's pride. When he falls into your hands, the war changes shape instantly. And at that moment, I already held another king. David II of Scotland had been our captive since Neville's Cross years earlier, so now incredibly, England held both the King of Scotland and the King of France. The political leverage was immense. It was like having two doors unlocked at once, one in the north, one across the Channel. With Scotland, I chose a measured solution. In the autumn of 1357, an agreement was reached that would finally bring the long Scottish conflict to a close. David was released in exchange for a large ransom and firm terms. I could have pushed harder. I could have tried to revive old claims and draw Scotland under the English crown outright. But I understood what my grandfather had learned, and what my father had failed to accept. Scotland could not be held forever by force alone without draining England. A stable border, secured by political terms and money, was the wiser prize. France, however, was a different kind of contest. Jean was brought to England and held in conditions appropriate to his rank, because the way you treat a captive king is part of the negotiation. In those years, there were talks, drafts, arguments, and shifting proposals. England's demands were substantial: security for Calais, a wider Aquitaine, recognition of territory that would create a powerful English sphere in France. In return, we would consider releasing Jean and, at least in theory, scaling back the most explosive claim of all, my claim to the French throne. But negotiations with France do not move cleanly. The French could not accept terms that made their kingdom look like a broken inheritance to be divided, and I, having tasted victory at Crécy and seeing what England could accomplish, was not inclined to sell cheaply. So when the first draft agreement stalled, I prepared once more for war. In the autumn of 1359, I crossed again to Calais with a large army. The campaign was harsh and destructive, marked by long marching and tense standoffs. We threatened Reims, we pressed toward Paris, but the French, wiser now and more cautious, avoided the kind of decisive battle that had ruined them before. They understood that fighting me head-on on ground of my choosing was dangerous. They preferred attrition, delay, and defense. Then nature struck with a brutality no army could match. Near Chartres in the spring of 1360, a violent storm, hail and cold, battered the army. Men and horses suffered. The weather did what weapons could not. It reminded every commander that even the best campaign can be undone by forces beyond planning. After that, both sides moved again toward negotiation. Exhaustion played its part, so did realism. The result was the Treaty of Brigny, agreed in 1360. It reshaped the war's first great phase. England gained Calais, the county of Poitou, and a significantly expanded Aquitaine, territory that for a time made England's position in France stronger than at any other moment of the conflict. In exchange, I agreed to renounce my claim to the French throne, though in truth both sides remained wary, and some details would never be fully settled in the way parchment suggests they can be. Still, Brittany marked something undeniable, the peak of English power in France under my rule. What followed was not a decade of triumphal marching, but something rarer in my reign: breathing room. The 1360s became a period of comparative calm, and in that calm we did something that often matters more than a single battle. We built, we restructured, we rebalanced. We made reforms that would last longer than any campaign season. In 1362, we worked on the wool staple, the great mechanism of England's wool trade. Wool was not just a commodity, it was a pillar of our economy, and therefore a pillar of our war-making ability. By pushing the staple toward Calais, we tied trade more tightly to our continental foothold. Calais was not only a fortress now, it was a commercial gateway. That same year, something else shifted, quietly but profoundly. For generations, French had dominated the language of law and government in England, a legacy of the Norman conquest. Yet the people of England spoke English, and increasingly the realm's identity was turning towards its own tongue. In 1362, the Statute of Pleading promoted English use in the courts, even if French still lingered in documents and tradition. Then in the following year, Parliament's opening business was conducted in English. It was more than a linguistic change. It was a statement: the kingdom was becoming more itself. Beyond England, we strengthened governance where our authority was always contested, Ireland. In the early 1360s, I entrusted much of Ireland's administration to my son Lionel of Clarence. Ireland was not a quiet possession. English rule there was strong in certain regions and weak in others, constantly challenged by local powers and cultural pull. Lionel's efforts culminated in a major assembly at Kilkenny in 1366, producing statutes meant to protect English interests and prevent English settlers from being absorbed into Irish customs. By modern standards, those laws were harsh. By medieval standards, they were a defensive measure, an attempt to preserve political identity in a frontier society where borders were not only lines on maps, but lines in language, marriage, and daily life. Looking back, the 1360s were a plateau. England stood tall in France. Scotland was settled on terms we could live with. The economy stabilized after plague. Parliament grew more significant because it had become essential to funding and governance. And the crown, my crown, felt secure in a way it had not in my youth. But I also learned something else in those years. Peace is not a permanent condition. It is a truce between ambitions. And as the decade closed, I could feel my own strength beginning to fade, slowly at first, then more sharply. The wars would return. The realm would face new storms, and the last part of my reign would be carried increasingly by my sons and my ministers. Yet, if there is one truth that stands above the noise of later setbacks, it is this. In those years between Poitiers and Brittany, England did not merely win battles. England proved it could shape Europe.
By the late 1360s, I could feel the ground shifting beneath my reign. Not from an enemy's charge, not from a rebellion at home, but from something quieter and far more stubborn, my own weakening body. I was no longer the young king who could ride hard for days and wake ready to do it again. By 1369, people around me began to notice what I tried to hide, the fatigue that lingered, the days when my mind felt slow, the moments when my strength seemed to drain without warning. Whatever the cause, illness, strokes, the simple toll of decades of war and rule, the result was the same. I was still king, but I could no longer carry every burden with my own hands. And that was precisely when the war returned. France, under King Charles V, was not the France I had faced in my younger years. Charles was patient, methodical, and unwilling to gamble his kingdom on dramatic battles. He rebuilt French strength carefully, choosing caution over pride. And when unrest flared within Aquitaine, our hard-won possession, Charles saw his opening. He summoned my son, the Black Prince, to appear before him, as if the prince were a subject and not the heir to England. My son refused, and with that refusal, Charles declared Aquitaine forfeit. It happened fast. One moment we were living in the uneasy calm of the Brittany peace. The next, France was again claiming the right to strip our lands and test our authority. So I revived my claim to the throne of France once more. Some people later asked why I returned to that claim after having renounced it. The answer is simple. Charles was trying to pull Aquitaine back under French sovereignty. If I accepted that, I accepted the humiliation of homage again. I accepted that England's king would forever bow for his own lands. I could not accept it, not as a matter of pride alone, but as a matter of security. A king who must kneel can always be forced to kneel again. But this new phase of war was different from the glorious years of Crécy and Calais. I did not lead the great expeditions myself. I wanted to at times, but my body did not always obey. Power increasingly moved through my sons, especially John of Gaunt, and through the men who surrounded them. And without my direct presence on campaign, England's position in France began to slip. Charles V avoided decisive battle and retook territory piece by piece. He used diplomacy, local alliances, and careful sieges. He understood that the English advantage, the longbow, the discipline, the ability to win on chosen ground, could be blunted if France refused to fight where I wanted. Then came the sea. In 1372, our fleet suffered a severe defeat off La Rochelle. The details mattered less than the consequence. It weakened our ability to resupply our territories in the southwest. An empire across the channel is only as strong as the ships that feed it. When sea control falters, even the best-held towns begin to feel like islands. We tried to answer with force. In 1373, John of Gaunt led a vast chevauchée from Calais to Bordeaux, an exhausting march through hostile land. It left devastation behind, but it did not achieve the strategic result we needed. It did not restore English dominance in the north of France. It did not break Charles' grip. Instead, it revealed a painful truth. Raids alone could not hold a shrinking empire together when the enemy fought with patience and calculation. By the middle of the 1370s, England's continental holdings were reduced to what could realistically be defended: Calais in the north and pockets of Gascony around Bordeaux in the southwest. That is not the story I wanted my reign's later years to tell, but kings do not always choose the shape of their final chapters. Sometimes the body declines, and the kingdom must move on without the king's full strength. While France pressed us abroad, England faced its own strains at home, especially the strain of money. War is not only fought with arrows and horses, it is fought with coin, taxes, loans, and the patience of the political nation, and by the 1370s, that patience was wearing thin. Parliament was called more than once to request financing. Each time the realm answered, but not without demands.
Officials were criticized, ministers were replaced. The balance between crown and parliament, which had been evolving throughout my reign, became sharper. England was learning in a hard way that war forces accountability. The moment this tension reached its peak was in 1376, in what later generations would call the Good Parliament. It was called, as so many parliaments were, for money. But once assembled, it became something more, a forum for grievances, for anger at corruption, for impatience with those who seemed to profit while the realm bled. Even John of Gaunt became a target, partly because he stood so close to power as my strength faded, and partly because people fear the man who might become the next master of the realm. Then in June of that same year, my son, the Black Prince, died. I had raised him as my heir, my continuation, the one who would carry forward everything we had built and fought for. He had proven himself in war. He had carried the burdens of Aquitaine, and yet illness took him, as illness takes men regardless of their courage. His death changed the line of succession. The crown would pass not to my son, but to his son, my grandson, Richard, still a boy. The loss of the Black Prince was not simply political. It was personal in a way I rarely allowed myself to show. It felt like the strongest part of my future collapsing into silence. In the months that followed, my own health worsened. In late September 1376, I suffered seriously from a large abscess. The pain was severe, and my movement became difficult. For a time, I seemed close to death. I made changes to my will, not because I wanted to surrender, but because a king must prepare even when he hopes to recover. And I did recover, briefly. But the recovery was not the return of youth. It was the short rally of an old man who refuses to admit the end is near. By February 1377, the abscess burst, leaving me weakened and impaired, and from then on, my body became a constant reminder that no king rules forever, no matter how bright his victories once were. I spent my final months at Sheen Palace beside the Thames, where later another royal residence would rise and the world would remember the place by a different name. The river moved outside my windows with the indifferent calm of nature. Men still came with petitions, councils still formed. My sons and advisors still argued over war and finance and policy, but more and more I watched rather than acted. Some days in the quiet, I thought back to Windsor, to the boy born under stone arches, to Nottingham, where I seized my kingship with my own hands, to Halidon Hill, where I learned to make the ground itself my ally, to Cressy, where an unoutnumbered army held because discipline was stronger than pride, to Calais, where endurance gave England a foothold that would last beyond my lifetime. And I wondered, not with regret but with the sober clarity of age, what all of it meant. On the 21st of June, 1377, I died at Sheen. I do not imagine the moment as dramatic. It was not a battlefield, not banners, no trumpets, only the quiet presence of attendants and clergy, candle smoke in the air, and the slow narrowing of the world to a final breath. Afterwards, the kingdom mourned as kingdoms do. My body was prepared with reverence, and the funeral procession moved through London. Knights in black, banners lowered, people lining the streets. Chroniclers wrote of grief and lamentation, and perhaps they were not wrong. I had ruled for 50 years. Many people in England had known no other king. Then the crown passed to Richard II, my grandson, 10 years old, crowned into a world that was already sharpening its teeth again. If there is one lesson my ending carries, it is this. A king can build greatness, but he cannot guarantee what comes after him. I could win battles and sign treaties, reform coinage and strengthen parliament, raise castles and create orders of chivalry. I could shape England's place in Europe and give it confidence it had not known under my father. But I could not hand my successor my own strength. And so my reign ended the way all reigns end, not with a final victory, but with the passing of responsibility to a new generation. Yet when I look back, when I measure the long arc from the boy at Windsor to the old man at Sheen, I know what I gave England. I gave it a sense of power that reached beyond its shores. I gave it institutions that grew stronger under pressure. I gave it symbols that still endure, and I gave it for a time a position in France in the Channel that made Europe pay attention. And perhaps that is the closest any king can come to immortality, not living forever, but leaving behind a realm that still feels the shape of your hand long after it is gone.